We return to the piano sonatas of Beethoven. This is Lecture 2. It is entitled Homage to Mozart. My friends, we've got a lot to do in this second lecture. First, we've got to create an historical context for Beethoven and the classical style he inherited, a musical style brought to a height of perfection by Haydn and Mozart. Second, we've got to begin a study of the classical era musical forms, formal structures that Beethoven first mastered and then increasingly departed from, or mutilated if you prefer, on his road to compositional radicalism. Thirdly, we will observe Beethoven's four-movement Piano Sonata No. 1 in F minor, Opus 2 No. 1 of 1795, as both a classical homage to Mozart and as an example of Beethoven's pianistic and compositional audacity, an audacity already apparent in his earliest published works. Beethoven and classicism. Ludwig van Beethoven was baptized on December 17, 1770, in the city of Bonn. He died on March 26, 1827, in Vienna during a violent spring thunderstorm, his fist clenched and raised to the sky. In total, he lived 56 years and 99 days, not young by the standards of his day, but a mere slip of a youth by ours. To repeat the cliche that Beethoven lived during a time of great change is like saying that Cher has had cosmetic surgery. Well, yeah. Beethoven was born during the Enlightenment. The French Revolution began when he was 18 and a half, and Louis XVI was executed just a few weeks after he turned 22. Napoleon Bonaparte came to power in November of 1799 when Beethoven was just a few weeks shy of his 29th birthday. And Napoleon declared himself emperor in 1804 when Beethoven was 33. The Napoleonic Wars raged across Europe until 1814, during which time Beethoven's adopted city of Vienna was twice occupied by the French, in 1806 and again in 1809. Beethoven was 44 years old when the Bourbon dynasty was reestablished in France, and he lived out the remainder of his years in Vienna under the oppressive rule of Clemens Wenzel Nepomuk Lothar Fürst von Metternich. Back, please, to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was that mid-18th century social evolution that saw the growing middle class of Europe enter the mainstream of European society, really, for the first time. This increasingly large and wealthy middle class exerted tremendous pressures on the established European society, and gradually, the philosophic spirit of the second half of the 18th century came to embrace the individual, a sort of idealized every person, your ordinary Joe, or as they said in Germany, Biedermeier, your ordinary Meyer, as the essential unit in society. Now, this is not to say that during the Enlightenment, hereditary monarchies and their aristocracies did not still rule Europe. They most certainly did. But during the Enlightenment, the ruling class was generally, to some degree or another, enlightened. That is, concerned for the well-being of common people to a degree unheard of in previous European history. The Enlightenment's impact on musical style was profound. The ornate and intellectually complex music of the High Baroque was rejected as being too complicated, elitist, and out of touch with the new social reality of the mid and late 18th century. Slowly, a new, more melodically and expressively flexible musical style evolved, one that resonated with this new spirit of individualism that lay at the very heart of Enlightenment doctrine. The Enlightenment article of faith, that institution that does the greatest good for the greatest number is good, had its musical equivalent in the notion that music that appeals to the greatest number, providing it is written well and in good taste, is the best music. This so-called doctrine of accessibility resulted eventually in a musical style that celebrated melodic beauty and clarity above all else. This musical style eventually became known as the classical style, because like classical art, meaning ancient Greek art, this music of the Enlightenment celebrated clarity and beauty of line, meaning melody, balance and purity of form, meaning clear phrase structures and carefully wrought musical forms, and expressive restraint and good taste. The Enlightenment-inspired classical style reached its full maturity in and around the capital city of the Habsburg Empire, Vienna, between roughly 1770 and 1800 in the music of Joseph Haydn, Wolfgang Mozart, and many other lesser but by no means unimportant composers. Today, we refer to this period and this music as that of Viennese classicism. And it represents, my friends, one of the greatest periods in the history of all Western art. The Viennese classical style would appear to have been Ludwig van Beethoven's essential musical inheritance. We say would appear to have been because we'll discuss the importance of Johann Sebastian Bach later in the course. At the time Beethoven began composing his piano sonata in F minor during the mid-1790s, the music of Mozart was still being discovered by the listening public, and many of Haydn's greatest works had yet to be composed. All right, a few words regarding musical form. Any repertoire-driven survey course, just like this one, requires a working knowledge of musical form. Musical form refers to the internal structure, the architecture of a given movement of music. Look, for better or for worse, if we want to be able to observe and understand Beethoven's compositional growth and development through the lens of these wonderful piano sonatas, then we've got to have a basic understanding of the classical era musical forms that were his points of departure, his classical inheritance. Only then will we be able to appreciate just how radical Beethoven's innovations were. Please, back to the box. We cannot possibly appreciate how far outside the box Beethoven eventually went unless we first know what constituted that box. There are four essential musical forms that we will explore over the course of this survey. In the order we will encounter them, they are sonata form, minuet and trio / scherzo form, rondo form, and theme and variations form. Beethoven, Piano Sonata No. 1 in F minor, Opus 2, No. 1, 1795. Beethoven first performed the 3 piano sonatas published as Opus 2 sometime during the autumn of 1795 at a Friday morning concert at the home of Prince Karl Lichnowsky. Prince Lichnowsky had been a great patron of Mozart's and was in the process of becoming a great patron of Beethoven's. Among the audience that morning was Beethoven's former teacher, the great and famous Joseph Haydn, to whom Beethoven had dedicated these Opus 2 sonatas, a dedication that was made more for political reasons than out of personal affection. It is extremely significant that the first of these Opus 2 sonatas, the first of Beethoven's piano sonatas to be published, is in the dark, dramatic key of F minor. It's a statement, my friends. It's a proclamation to the music-consuming world that this is serious music, and I will be taken seriously. Oh, some telling statistics. Of Mozart's 19 piano sonatas, only 2 are in minor. Of Haydn's 62 piano sonatas, only 5 are in minor. Late 18th century piano music did not do minor very often. 3 of the 4 movements of Beethoven's Opus 2 No. 1 are in the key of F minor, and 3 of the 4 movements are in sonata form. Please, a word score guide of Beethoven's piano sonata in F minor, Opus 2 No. 1, has been provided for your pleasure and edification. Now, more than anything else, the word score is intended to help you visualize the musical forms, the structures under discussion. So, please, provided that you're not driving, jogging, or performing a vasectomy, I would respectfully recommend that you have the word score within easy hand's reach. A sonata form movement is one in which multiple principal themes, typically 2 themes, are stated, developed, and recapitulated. A sonata form movement typically consists of 4 large sections of music: the exposition, the development, the recapitulation, and the coda. It is during the exposition that the principal themes, usually 2 in number, are presented or exposed, thus the term exposition. The first theme, traditionally the more dramatic of the 2, is presented in the home key, what we call the tonic key of the movement. All right, movement 1. Now, as we just observed, the first theme of a sonata form movement is generally the more dramatic of the themes. And here, Beethoven's Theme 1 is no exception. It is a spare, angular, dramatic melody that consists of two hugely contrasting melodic ideas, or motives. An opening, bounding, rising arpeggio that is a chord expressed as a melody, followed by a fast, tight, densely packed embellishment called a turn. Now, this theme is a clear homage to Mozart. Some back-to-back listening will be most enlightening. First, we'll hear Beethoven's Theme 1 in its entirety, followed by the opening of the first movement of Mozart's Little G minor Symphony, Koschel 183 of 1773, followed by the opening of the fourth movement of Mozart's G minor Symphony, Koschel 550 of 1788. All right, please, first, Beethoven Piano Sonata in F minor, Opus 2, number 1, Movement 1, Theme 1. Now Mozart Symphony in G minor, Koschel 183, Movement 1, Theme 1. And now Mozart Symphony in G minor, Koschel 550, Movement 4, Theme 1. There wasn't a person in the music room there at Prince Lichnowsky's Casa who wouldn't have recognized the close resemblance between Beethoven's and Mozart's themes. Of course, it's not the ingredients, but the chef who makes the dish. And in the obvious resemblance between themes, Beethoven is here, at the very beginning of his career, making a powerful and even cocky statement. That statement? Oh, I honor Mozart. I will even, up to a point, emulate Mozart. But I am Ludwig van Beethoven, and I will be different. Mozart's theme is for me but a point of departure, and I will work out, contrast, and develop it in a way utterly my own. Oh my goodness, Beethoven at 24 years of age was supremely self-confident in his talent and in his vision as a composer. And that self-confidence is made apparent right here in his first published piano sonata by his willingness to be compared to and differentiated from the great and revered and recently deceased Mozart. Beethoven's opening theme, brief as it is also a textbook model of phrase structure, phrase attenuation, and phrase liquidation above and beyond its resemblance to Mozart. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. The theme itself is but 8 measures long. Those 8 measures break down into 5, yes, 5 extraordinary phrases. Phrase 1 consists of the first 2 measures, the first statement of the rising arpeggio, followed by the tightly wound turn, or what the folks at the orchestral mecca of Mannheim would have at the time called a rocket, followed by a birdie. All of it outlining the tonic F minor chord. The second phrase, also 2 measures long, moves the music of the first phrase up a step. And this is a process called sequencing, by the way. And in doing so, outlines a new harmony, the dominant chord, the chord of tension. Please, phrase 2, measures 3 and 4. These 2 opening phrases, the second being a step higher than the first, feature at the uppermost notes an ascent from an A flat to a B flat. Let's listen for those high notes, shall we? Well, three's the charm, right? And we expect this upwards reaching line to continue. And continue it will, but not yet. Beethoven's got some kick-butt phrase attenuation to indulge in before the anticipated ascent can continue. The next phrase, the third phrase, is only one measure long. It consists of the closing turn only, the birdie of phrase 1. Please, let's hear phrase 3. The fourth phrase is also one measure long, and it consists of the closing turn, the birdie of phrase 2. Now, in contracting, in attenuating the opening two-measure phrases into these two one-measure phrases, Beethoven is here creating an extraordinary sense of compression, of progressively squeezing together time and space. It's like toothpaste under increasingly high pressure, and indeed the rising A-flat, B-flat up at the very top of the theme desperately seeks resolution upwards and outwards. Please, the first 6 measures. Yes, well, phrase 5 is the punchline, the arrival, the climax achieved. Fortissimo, very loud, the pianist's right hand plays an arpeggiated chord that relates back to the rising rocket of phrases 1 and 2, a chord that has as its top note the long-awaited movement to a C. Listen. Was that as good for you as it was for me? Now please, having achieved that high C and the resolution back to the tonic chord that supports the C, Beethoven liquidates the theme with a drowsy little descent of 6 notes that dissipates the tension and arrives at and pauses on an open cadence. Phrase 5 in its entirety. Now, one last thing to point out before we hear this theme in its entirety. Just before the melody touches bottom and pauses, Beethoven has inserted a quiet little embellishment of 3 rising notes. Do we all recognize the turn, the birdie here, upside down in inversion? Excellent. All right, the theme from the top. Now that, my friends, is a lot of information, a lot of thrust, a lot of drama for just 8 measures. There's not a single extraneous note. Nothing is plugged in just for affect. This theme is lean, mean, clean, and utterly to the point. Opus 2, and already vintage Beethoven. Back, please, to sonata form. This first relatively dramatic theme is followed by a section of music called the modulating bridge. It's called a bridge because it transits or bridges the musical space between themes 1 and 2. We perceive it as a transition because by its nature, a bridge will be built out of various small melodic fragments called motives, strung together in such a way as to create momentum without having a powerful thematic personality of its own. We call it a modulating bridge because it also effects a key change, so that the second theme it modulates to will not only be characterized by its own tune, but by its own key as well. An operatic metaphor, please. The difference between a theme and a bridge is the same as the difference between an aria and a recitative. An aria is a melodic construct of great substance that is about the feelings of the character singing the aria. Recitative, the half-sung, half-spoken episodes heard between arias, is about the words being sung and the actions those words represent. An aria then epitomizes a character and his or her emotions. A recitative epitomizes action and movement. Well, in just the same way, the themes of a sonata form movement are the characters of the movement, and the modulating bridge, and later the development section, are action music, music of movement. Beethoven's modulating bridge here consists of 3 distinct parts. Part 1 sees theme 1 rise out of the bass, sounding at first like a continuation of the theme Part 2 of the modulating bridge features a modulatory sequence based on the turn, the birdie of theme 1. Part 3 of the modulating bridge features falling scalar fragments in the treble heard against rising fragments in the bass. These falling fragments that conclude the modulating bridge and introduce theme 2 are not just scalar chopped liver, my friends. The entire modulating bridge, all 3 parts, is about a descent from E flat down to G, a descent that becomes more explicit and intense as the bridge progresses. Where have we heard that descent of 6 notes before? At the conclusion of theme 1, in phrase 5. That's where. Please, back to back. Just first the conclusion of the modulating bridge. And now, please, phrase 5 of theme 1. There's our descending line, and it's echoed in the modulating bridge. I would tell you that we're going to hear this group of descending 6 notes everywhere in this movement. Indeed, everywhere in the piano sonata. I'll point some of them out as we go, with the understanding that this descending 6-note motive constitutes the essential building block of the entire sonata. In his book, The Beethoven Sonatas and the Creative Experience, Indiana University Press, 1994, Professor Kenneth Drake spends 12 pages just identifying the various instances of this descending 6-note motive in the F minor sonata. The larger point, one we'll explore at length during this course. Beethoven elevated pure motivic development to a point far beyond anything that had existed before him. If Mozart was a sculptor creating long, gorgeous themes out of a wealth of different motives, then Beethoven was a mosaic artist, forging his singularly compact themes out of the simplest melodic constructs imaginable, tiny little motivic chips or shards that, when taken by themselves, seem to offer almost no musical promise whatsoever. Analyzing Beethoven is like analyzing matter itself. We keep getting down to smaller and smaller units until, when faced with the essential building blocks of a piece, we wonder how such simple, even banal elements can be forged into a sum so much greater than their parts. Certainly, there's an economy, an angularity that characterizes Beethoven's music more often than not, a result of his almost pathological minimalism, to use no more notes than are absolutely necessary. Now back to sonata form. The second theme of a sonata form movement will typically be the more lyric theme, although theme 2 here in the first movement of Beethoven's F minor sonata is anything but lyric. It consists of 3 component parts. Part 1 is based on a falling arpeggio as opposed to the rising arpeggio that began theme 1, a falling arpeggio that outlines the dominant chord of the new key of A flat major. Please, note how certain of the pitches, their F flats, color and darken the key of A flat major, giving it a minorish tinge. Let me first play the beginning of theme 2 as Beethoven wrote it. It goes something like this. Now, if that had been purely an A flat major without the F flats, it would have sounded like this. Oh, it's so pleasant in A flat major, but it's got those F flats, and it's got an edge, then a minorish tinge once again. Now, part 2 of theme 2 consists of a sequence of 3-note motives that rises overall the distance of 6 notes. Part 3 of theme 2 features 2 long scalar descents. Let's hear it. Theme 2 in its entirety. Following the appearance of theme 2, closing music, what we call cadential music, brings the exposition to its conclusion. Let's hear the cadential music that brings the exposition to its conclusion in the new key of A flat major. In almost all sonata form movements, the exposition is repeated in its entirety, the better for us to get the themes deep into our ears before the extended action sequence that is the development section. From the top, then, the entire exposition. The development section of a sonata form movement is an extended action sequence where the themes, the characters of our little musical drama, interact in some way or another. The only two generalizations we can make about development sections are: one, a development section will be built from material drawn from the exposition, and two, a development section, like a modulating bridge, will be characterized by lots of modulation, that is, change of key. Beethoven's development section consists here of 6 parts. In part 1, we hear 2 3-measure phrases based on theme 1. Parts 2 and 3 of the development section feature the falling arpeggio element of theme 2. In part 2, we hear it in the treble, and in part 3, in the bass. Part 4 of the development section features a series of syncopated notes that bounce back and forth between the treble and the bass. Parts 5 and 6 of the development section redirect the harmony back towards the tonic key of F minor in anticipation of the recapitulation. Part 5 is a lengthy passage built on a falling 2-note motive in the treble heard against a sustained C in the bass. 8 quiet, ticking Cs introduce Part 6, the last section of the development, in which turns, or birdies if you prefer, drawn from theme 1 are heard over a bass line that descends towards the tonic pitch of F. Development section, Parts 5 and 6, followed by theme 1 in the recapitulation. The recapitulation of a sonata form movement sees the themes return in their original order, but with one essential twist. The second theme, heard back in the exposition in its own contrasting key, will now be heard in the recapitulation in the home key, that is, in the same key as theme 1. All right, following the recapitulation, most sonata form movements will feature a coda, that is, an extra section of music that brings the movement to a satisfying and most permanent conclusion. Let's hear the recapitulation and coda of this movement in their entirety. Movement 2, truncated sonata form. All right, a so-called truncated sonata form movement is a sonata form without a development section, just an exposition, recapitulation, and a coda. In both its structure and opera-style melodic embellishments, this second movement betrays the influence again of Mozart, who often used this form in his slow movements and whose opera-style piano writing made the instrument sing in a way it had not done before. We hear theme 1 in its entirety. Movement 3, minuet and trio form. The second of the classical era musical forms with which we must be familiar is minuet and trio form. The minuet, a stately, moderately paced three-step dance, is the only Baroque era dance to survive into the instrumental music of the classical era. The classical era minuet maintained the moderately paced triple meter of the Baroque model, as well as the large-scale structure of the Baroque model. Two contrasting minuets played back-to-back, followed by a return to the original minuet, creating a large-scale A-B-A structure. Over time, the second minuet, the contrasting minuet, section B, came to be known as the trio. The return to the opening minuet after the trio, the closing A section of the A-B-A structure, came to be called the da capo because literally it is the back to the top, the back to the beginning. Beethoven's third movement, minuet and trio, here in the F minor sonata, is a brilliant example of just the sort of rhythmic manipulation, motive-driven themes, and thematic fragmentation and reconfiguration that will characterize his mature compositions. Beethoven's opening minuet theme is built from a three-note motive that begins on the upbeat, that is, the third and final beat of each measure. I'll demonstrate by separating the three-note motives from each other. I'll play measures 1 and 2. That's it. That's the key to this piece. The action of the minuet intensifies as these three-note motives increasingly connect into larger six-note motives, which are in turn followed by two cadence units that bring the first large phrase of the minuet to its conclusion. Please, the minuet from the beginning. The second phrase of Beethoven's minuet is a virtual development section. The three-note motive is here fragmented into a series of interlocking two-note motives which modulate towards and cadence in the new key of B-flat minor. The cadence unit is repeated and then reduced to a three-note unit. This reduced three-note cadence unit is suddenly used to spin out a violent descending passage that powers the minuet towards its final phrase. The final small phrase of the minuet, it's written as A' in your word scores, sees a further intensification of the opening thematic material via imitation between the bass and treble and a series of boldly descending trills before the energy is allowed to dissipate and the minuet comes to its conclusion. My friends, that's some minuet, one your word scores will truly help you to appreciate. The trio, the central minuet, features an engaging, vaguely rustic fiddle-style tune that, despite its sunny disposition, is drawn directly from the violent descending passage that powered the minuet to its conclusion and was itself a product of the three-note reduction of the cadential unit that was a direct outgrowth of the opening minuet theme. A back-to-back comparison is called for. First, the violent descending passage that powered phrase B of the minuet to its conclusion. And now, the opening of the trio. Isn't good motivic development metamorphosis fun? Oh, yes, it is. Contrasting sections of music seem somehow to belong because they are indeed related at some primal level or another. Unified variety, varied unity, whatever we want to call it, it's great composing. And Beethoven, at 24, was already a great composer. Movement 4, sonata form. My friends, time precludes us from doing the sort of in-depth examination of the fourth and final movement that, frankly, it deserves. Some large statements then, followed by a listening to the recapitulation and the end of the movement. Statement 1. This is dark, stormy, explosive music, filled with hammered chords, rippling arpeggios, and extreme contrasts of mood and dynamics. Statement 2. Pianistically, that is, in terms of the way he employs the piano as an instrument. This movement is, for Beethoven, the music of the future. Because in 1795, there wasn't a forte piano on the planet that could realize and reproduce the dynamic and expressive extremes he calls for in the score. Statement 3. In lieu of a traditional development section, Beethoven introduces an entirely new theme, a charming, gracious, thoroughly Viennese tune that contrasts mightily with the fire and angst of the exposition. All right, please, we hear the recapitulation and conclusion of this movement, and with it, the conclusion of this remarkable piano sonata number 1. Now, before we listen to that excerpt, I told you that in lieu of a genuine development section, Beethoven introduces in this sonata form movement a very Viennese, a very lyric, a very easygoing theme in lieu of that development section, a theme that creates tremendous contrast with this otherwise furious and angular outer sections, the likes of which we just heard. A quick word about that. We should understand that sonata form is used constantly in any piece of music. In the case of this sonata, we have 3 sonata form or sonata version form movements. The first movement, sonata form, the second movement, truncated sonata form, and then this odd developmentless, or should we say lyric development section, fourth movement, sonata form. Please, the important movement is the first one. It is in the first movement sonata form that a composer will usually most closely toe the line and write a piece that follows the traditional template of what sonata form is supposed to be all about: exposition, development, recapitulation. As we move through the multiple movements of a piano sonata or a symphony or a string quartet or any other multi-movement work, we should understand that the rules get a little looser as we go, until finally, as we get to the fourth movement, well, really, the rules hardly apply. And this is not just Beethoven being an individual. We see this in the music of Mozart. We see this in the music of Haydn. We see it in the music of many of their contemporaries. Sonata form will not be used or applied as rigorously in a final movement as it would be in the first movement. Now, this is an important thing to note right now, because as we move through this course, we will observe steadily Beethoven imbuing his final movements with ever more dramatic weight and importance. Part of Beethoven's classical inheritance says that the last movement is the lightest movement, the least important intellectually and emotionally, and the one, therefore, is most likely to be altered and changed. Well, as Beethoven develops his compositional head of steam, these last movements will become infinitely more important, much weightier both intellectually and emotionally. And the sort of liberties he might have taken early in his career will be replaced by an absolutely seismic degree of change and importance as he invests his last movements with ever more content. Please, our conclusions. Beethoven's F minor sonata is an angular sounding work. So much of the writing is a bare-bones two-part texture that the sonata gives an almost minimalist impression that actually increases its intensity, my friends, by forcing us to listen to everything that actually does happen. There is simply not a wasted note in the entire piece. Likewise, there are few, if any, moments of prettiness for its own sake. Now, from a contemporary 1795 point of view, the pleasure level, the pleasure content of this sonata was minimal, a potentially big problem in an environment where piano sonatas were considered an amateur entertainment and were, in general, meant to appeal to the widest possible public. Now, this very issue is addressed in a critique of Beethoven's Opus 12 sonatas for piano and violin, which were composed in 1799. The review, published in the prestigious Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, might just as well have addressed the piano sonata in F minor, Opus 2, number 1. And we quote, "To read through these curious, extraordinarily difficult sonatas requires great effort. Beethoven is going his own way, but what an eccentric way it is. Intellect, intellect, and more intellect, but without nature, without song, without beautiful melody. Nothing but a mass of learning without even a good method of conveying it," unquote. When we return in Lecture 3, we'll immediately tackle this issue of experimentation in Beethoven's early piano music and why he was able to get away with writing music that was, by every contemporary account, exceedingly difficult to play and understand. Music that was often perceived as being even ugly to listeners accustomed to the niceties and restraint of classicism. Until then, thank you.